The first light of dawn painted golden streaks across my 5 acres of heaven. I stood on the weathered porch of my modest ranch house, breathing in the crisp morning air. My coffee steamed in the ceramic mug clutched between my hands as I surveyed my domain. This property represented everything I had worked for over 15 years of saving and planning. No more apartment living. No more asking permission to have pets. No more sharing walls with noisy neighbors. In the distance, my small herd of goats grazed contentedly on the rocky terrain near the eastern fence line. 8 of them, each with distinct personalities and quirks. There was Old Man Jenkins, the patriarch with a gray beard that nearly touched the ground. The twins, Salt and Pepper, always moving in synchronized motions. The baby of the group, Peanut, who still sometimes tried to climb into my lap despite weighing 40 pounds. And then there were the brothers, Havoc and Mayhem, appropriately named for their tendency to find trouble wherever they went. I had purchased this property specifically because it sat on the outskirts of town, far from restrictive city ordinances. The real estate listing had promised rural living with proximity to modern conveniences, and that was exactly what I wanted. The nearest neighbor was over a quarter-mile away, and the only sign of civilization was the rooftops of the Willow Creek Estate subdivision, barely visible beyond my tree line to the west. My goats served multiple purposes. They were pets first, each one hand-raised from birth. But they also provided fresh milk that I had learned to transform into artisanal cheeses. Their natural appetites for brush and weeds kept large portions of my property maintained without machinery. This was the sustainable, simple life I had always dreamed about. 3 months after moving in, the certified letter arrived. I remember that Tuesday morning vividly because it was the first cool day of autumn. The official envelope felt unusually heavy in my hands. Inside was a formal notice on letterhead I did not recognize. Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The contents were bewildering. According to this document, my property was in violation of community guidelines regarding unauthorized livestock and improper land use. The letter made no sense. My property was not part of any subdivision. I had specifically checked county records before purchasing to ensure there were no restrictions on keeping farm animals. Yet here was a document claiming jurisdiction over my land, threatening fines if I did not remedy the situation within 14 days. I called the county assessor office immediately. The clerk sounded apologetic as she explained the situation. Apparently, when the Willow Creek Estates development had expanded 3 years ago, they had successfully petitioned to annex several surrounding properties into their jurisdiction through a zoning technicality. My ranch had been among those properties. The previous owner had received notification, but had never contested it, perhaps because they were not keeping animals at the time. The following week, I attended my first HOA meeting. The community center was immaculate, with polished floors and tasteful artwork depicting pastoral scenes that ironically contained no actual farm animals. I felt immediately out of place in my work boots and flannel shirt among the pressed khakis and polo shirts. The committee members regarded me with thinly veiled disapproval as I explained my situation. Their responses were courteous but cold. While we understand your desire for rural pursuits, Willow Creek Estates has standards to maintain, explained one gray-haired man whose name tag identified him as Gerald, the treasurer. The presence of farm animals reduces property values for everyone. Surely you can understand our concern. Over the next several weeks, the warnings intensified. First came notices about my fence style being non-compliant, then complaints about my barn needing to be repainted in approved community colors. Each time I attempted to discuss compromise, I encountered the same bureaucratic stonewalling. Perhaps you would be happier selling your property to a developer, suggested one committee member after a particularly frustrating exchange. The implication was clear. I did not belong here. My way of life was incompatible with their vision of suburban perfection. But this was my home. These were my animals, and I was not going anywhere without a fight. The formal violations began arriving weekly, each in the same crisp envelope with the Willow Creek Estates logo embossed in green and gold. The first fine was for $100 for inappropriate animal husbandry within community boundaries. The second jumped to $150 for failure to remedy livestock situation after initial notification. By the third week, the amount had doubled to $300, with a note that the fines would continue to compound until compliance was achieved. I spent evenings hunched over my laptop, researching HOA bylaws and county regulations until my eyes burned from screen glare. Sleep became a luxury as I printed documents, highlighted relevant passages, and assembled what I hoped would be a compelling case. There had to be exceptions, grandfather clauses, or legal precedents that could protect my right to keep my animals. Agricultural exemptions existed in county law. Properties over 3 acres actively engaged in agricultural pursuits could qualify for special zoning considerations. My 5 acres and goat milk production should technically qualify. I found cases where HOAs had overreached their authority when attempting to restrict legitimate agricultural activities. I compiled everything into a binder, complete with tabbed sections and a table of contents. It was during my third HOA meeting that I first encountered Margaret Holloway face to face. Until then, I had only seen her signature on violation notices. She entered the boardroom 5 minutes late, making an entrance rather than an arrival. Designer clothes, immaculate silver hair, and jewelry that caught the fluorescent lighting at every turn. "I understand we have an ongoing livestock situation," she announced before even taking her seat at the head of the conference table. Her gaze found me immediately, eyes narrowing as she assessed my appearance. "You must be the farmer." The way she said farmer made it sound like a slur rather than an occupation. The room fell silent as I stood and introduced myself properly. I opened my binder and began presenting my research, pointing out the agricultural exemptions that should apply to my property. For a moment, hope flickered as several board members exchanged contemplative glances. Gerald, the treasurer who had been dismissive at our first meeting, actually nodded at one of my points about county jurisdiction superseding HOA authority in certain agricultural cases. Then Margaret leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the polished table. The sound cut through the room like a metronome counting down my remaining time. "This is not some rural backwater where people can keep barnyard animals," she declared, adjusting her designer glasses. "We have standards here. Property values in Willow Creek Estates have increased 12% annually precisely because we maintain strict community guidelines." She turned to address the other board members rather than me. "Would any of you want to live next to goats? The smell alone would be intolerable." I attempted to interject that my property was not next to anyone, with the nearest home being a quarter-mile away. The smell argument was entirely fabricated, but Margaret continued speaking over me, her voice rising just enough to establish dominance without seeming impolite. "Furthermore," she continued, "Mr. Davis on Sycamore Lane is attempting to sell his home. The listing agent has already informed us that potential buyers expressed concern after seeing farm animals visible from the development entrance. This affects everyone in our community." The room divided before my eyes. The few sympathetic faces quickly hardened as they processed the threat to their investments. Gerald, who had nodded at my research moments before, now studied his notepad intently, avoiding eye contact. One woman at the end of the table, who introduced herself as bait, attempted to suggest a compromise. Perhaps we could consider a variance for existing animals, with the stipulation that no additional livestock would be added. Margaret dismissed this with a wave of her hand. Start making exceptions, and soon everyone will want chickens and pigs and who knows what else. Our guidelines exist for a reason. Walking to my truck after the meeting, I noticed the change immediately. Neighbors who had previously waved now averted their eyes. Two men standing beside a perfectly manicured lawn turned their backs as I approached. I had become the enemy, the threat to their property values, the outsider who refused to conform. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. The ultimatum was clear: 30 days to remove all livestock or face daily fines of $250, potential property liens, and legal action. The letter concluded with a sentence that made my blood run cold. Failure to comply will result in enforcement measures as permitted by Community Bylaws Section 7.3. I had read Section 7.3. It authorized the HOA to take necessary steps to remedy violations after sufficient notice. But what did that mean in practical terms? Could they really force me to give up my animals? As I watched my goats peacefully grazing that evening, I realized the battle lines had been drawn. Margaret had severely underestimated both my determination and the stubborn temperament of my goats. This fight was just beginning. 20 days into the 30-day ultimatum, I had begun making contingency plans. My friend Lisa, whose farm lay 15 miles outside town, had offered temporary sanctuary for my goats if needed. I had contacted a local attorney specializing in property law, though his consultation fee alone had made my bank account wince. I had even begun documenting every interaction with the HOA in a detailed journal, complete with dates, times, and photographs. That Thursday started like any other. I left for work before sunrise, stopping briefly to check on the goats and fill their water troughs. Old man Jenkins butted his head affectionately against my leg as I scratched behind his ears. "Hang in there, buddy," I whispered. "We will figure this out." My job at the regional medical center required 12-hour shifts, and that particular day had been especially grueling. A multi-car accident had brought an influx of patients to the emergency department where I worked as a nurse. By the time I clocked out, exhaustion weighed on my shoulders like a physical burden. Rain had started falling during my drive home, beginning as a light drizzle but intensifying to a downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet. The clock on my dashboard read 8:17 p.m. when I turned onto the gravel road leading to my property. My headlights swept across the entrance gate, illuminating something unusual that made my heart stop. Heavy industrial padlocks and thick chains were woven through my gates, sealing them completely shut. A laminated notice fluttered in the downpour: property secured due to ongoing HOA violations. Panic surged through me as realization dawned. My goats had been without water since morning. Old man Jenkins needed his arthritis medication. Peanut would be frightened by the thunderstorm without access to his covered shelter. The rain intensified, drumming against my truck roof as I fumbled for my phone with trembling hands. The HOA emergency number rang 7 times before connecting to an automated message. "You have reached Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Our office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. If this is an emergency regarding community property, please press 1. I pressed 1, waited through another series of automated messages, and finally received another recording. All representatives are currently unavailable. Please leave a detailed message after the tone. 3 calls produced the same result. I tried Margaret's personal number, which I had obtained during one of our confrontations. Straight to voicemail. I left messages growing increasingly desperate with each call. "This is illegal imprisonment of animals," I shouted into my phone over the sound of thunder. "You cannot lock me out of my own property. My animals need care immediately." Standing in the freezing rain, watching water cascade down my face, I made a decision. The bolt cutters in my truck were there for land management, primarily for cutting fence wire when making repairs. I had never imagined using them like this, to break into my own property. The chain links were thick, industrial grade. Clearly Margaret had invested in proper equipment for this assault. My hands slipped on the metal handles as rain soaked through my clothes. Each squeeze of the bolt cutters required all my strength, the metal resisting before finally giving way with a snap that felt both liberating and deeply wrong. Pushing through the gate, I rushed toward the barn, my boots sliding in the mud as lightning illuminated the night sky in brief, violent flashes. The goats huddled together in their shelter, distressed from hours without attention. Their frightened bleats cut through me like physical pain as I counted them, ensuring all 8 were present and unharmed. Old Man Jenkins limped more noticeably than usual, his arthritis clearly bothering him without his medication. Peanut trembled against my leg, eyes wide with fear at each thunderclap. I worked quickly, refilling water troughs, distributing feed, and administering medication where needed. Once the animals were settled, the adrenaline that had carried me through began to subside, replaced by a cold fury unlike anything I had experienced before. This was more than property rights now. This was about the welfare of innocent animals and a fundamental violation of decency. I stood in the barn doorway, watching rain pound the earth as lightning split the sky. My clothes were soaked through, my body shivering, but I barely noticed. Something primal had awakened inside me as I tended to my frightened animals. This was war, and Margaret had just provided the battlefield. I spent that night in the barn, unable to leave my animals after what had happened. Sleep came in brief intervals, interrupted by the storm and my own churning thoughts. By morning, as gray light filtered through the barn windows, I had photographed everything: the broken chains, the laminated notice, the gate damage. I had also made a decision that would change everything. Legal documents covered every surface of my kitchen table as Richard, my attorney, pointed to specific clauses in the county records. Finding a lawyer I could afford had been challenging, but Richard had agreed to an initial consultation at a reduced rate after hearing my story. His office was modest, his suit well-worn but professional. He specialized in property disputes and had fought HOAs before. "Their jurisdiction is questionable at best," he explained, circling a zoning designation with his pen. "Your property sits in what was originally agricultural land. The HOA annexation paperwork has irregularities." Hope flickered as he outlined potential countermeasures. The gate incident constituted illegal restriction of access to private property. The danger posed to my animals could potentially be classified as animal endangerment. The improper notification process before the lockout violated state property laws. Then Richard quoted his retainer fee, and that hope died. Even his generous reduction left a figure far beyond what I could afford after the recent veterinary bills for Old Man Jenkins. My bank account was stretched to breaking point already. "Document everything," Richard advised as our consultation concluded. "Photograph all interactions, record all conversations if legal in your state. Keep a detailed log of all communications. And whatever you do, do not lose your temper with them publicly. That is exactly what they want." I spent the next several days installing security cameras around my property, positioning them to cover the gates, the driveway, and the perimeter near the subdivision. The expense strained my budget further, but the peace of mind was worth every penny. If the HOA attempted anything else, it would be captured on video. The following Tuesday evening found me back at the community center for another board meeting. This time I arrived prepared, with printed copies of county ordinances regarding property access, animal welfare laws, and regulations governing HOA authority limitations. Margaret Holloway barely looked up from her phone as I approached the podium for the public comment period. Her dismissal was evident in every gesture, from the way she tapped her pen impatiently to how she whispered to Gerald seated beside her while I presented my documentation. The actions taken against my property last Thursday constituted illegal trespassing, unauthorized modification of private property, and animal endangerment, I stated, keeping my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. I have consulted legal counsel and been advised that these actions exceed HOA authority under both state law and your own bylaws. Margaret finally glanced up, her expression bored rather than concerned. Our bylaws clearly state that enforcement measures may be taken after sufficient notification. You received multiple notices. Enforcement does not legally extend to locking a property owner out of their own land, I countered, sliding forward the relevant county statute. Furthermore, the welfare of animals was deliberately endangered by these actions. The room remained silent as board members glanced at each other uncomfortably. For a brief moment, I thought I might be making progress. Then Margaret straightened in her chair and delivered the bombshell. The board has authorized animal control to enter your property next Monday to remove all livestock, she announced, her voice carrying the finality of someone accustomed to absolute authority. This decision has been approved by majority vote in accordance with our emergency measures protocol. The room spun around me as neighbors avoided eye contact. I gripped the podium to steady myself, disbelief warring with rage. You cannot legally do that, I managed to say, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. We can and we will, Margaret replied coolly. Section 7.3 authorizes us to remedy ongoing violations that impact community standards and property values. Animal Control has agreed to assist based on our documentation of unauthorized livestock. This was not just about rules anymore. This was theft, invasion, the potential destruction of my small farm family. Looking around the room, I realized arguing further would be pointless. These people had already decided my animals did not deserve to exist in their perfect suburban world. Walking home that night, watching the sunset illuminate my modest ranch, determination hardened within me. I had 7 days before their planned invasion. 7 days to protect my animals from people who saw them as mere violations of suburban aesthetics. I could not win with lawyers or money, but perhaps there were other forms of justice available to those willing to think creatively and risk everything. As I reached my property line, a plan began forming in my mind. It would require perfect timing, careful preparation, and perhaps a bit of help from Mother Nature herself. Dawn had not yet broken as I loaded my trailer with silent efficiency. The eastern sky showed only the faintest hint of gray as I triple-checked the hitches and safety chains. This operation required precise timing and complete discretion. 6 of my 8 goats watched me with trusting eyes as I secured them for transport to Lisa's farm 20 miles beyond HOA territory. Old man Jenkins required special help boarding, his arthritic legs struggling with the ramp. The twins, Salt and Pepper, followed dutifully, their synchronized movements continuing even in this stressful situation. Peanut, always the nervous one, required gentle coaxing and reassurance. My two remaining goats, Havoc and Mayhem, aptly named brothers with notorious reputations, observed from their pen with suspicious interest. They were key to what came next. These two had particular talents that had often been the bane of my existence but might now prove incredibly useful. Havoc could dismantle nearly any fence given sufficient motivation. I had watched him methodically work gate latches with his mouth and horns until they yielded. His problem-solving abilities were uncanny for a goat. Mayhem, true to his name, had a palate for ornamental landscaping that bordered on artistic destruction. He could denude a decorative shrub in minutes, leaving nothing but stems. Together, they had once escaped their enclosure and stripped an entire row of my berry bushes before I could intervene. "You two are staying," I told them as I secured their special reinforced pen. "We have work to do." The forecast had been monitoring all week called for severe thunderstorms on Monday, exactly when Margaret's inspection committee planned their visit. The timing could not have been more perfect if I had arranged it myself. The Weather Service had upgraded the alert from Severe Thunderstorm Watch to Warning, predicting high winds, heavy rainfall, and possible flash flooding. My security cameras now covered every angle of my property, recording continuously to cloud storage where no one could delete the footage. The 4 cameras provided overlapping fields of view, ensuring no approach to my property would go undocumented. Each was weatherproofed and equipped with night vision capability. Throughout the day, I transformed my back acreage into a sanctuary hidden from prying eyes. The area behind the barn, not visible from any road or neighboring property, became my staging area. I constructed a temporary but secure enclosure that would be invisible to anyone inspecting the front of my property. At the same time, I deliberately left the front gate conspicuously damaged, as though broken from within rather than outside. The chain I had cut days before remained where it had fallen, creating the impression of abandonment. I removed my truck from the driveway and parked it behind the barn, out of sight. By sunset, everything was in place. My remaining goats had been moved to their reinforced enclosure in the back field, though I planned to relocate them to the front staging area just before the inspection. 6 of my animals were safely at Lisa's farm. Security cameras were operational and recording. I had printed multiple copies of my property deed, relevant legal statutes, and no trespassing notices. The distant rumble of thunder matched my mood perfectly as I completed final preparations. Weather radar showed the storm system moving steadily toward us, scheduled to arrive almost exactly when the inspection committee planned to visit. I had purposely not responded to the official inspection notice, creating the impression I might have temporarily abandoned the property. Havoc and Mayhem watched intently as I checked their special reinforced enclosure one final time, almost as if they understood their role in the coming battle. I had strategically placed their pen near the side gate, the very gate the HOA had used during their previous trespassing incident. "Tomorrow is the big day, boys," I told them, scratching Havoc behind his ears. "The HOA has declared war on the wrong farmer." Monday morning arrived with apocalyptic darkness. The storm system had intensified overnight, bringing black clouds that made 9 a.m. look like dusk. Weather alerts buzzed repeatedly on my phone, flash flood warnings, high wind advisories, and recommendations to avoid unnecessary travel. Perfect conditions for my purposes. I had positioned myself in the barn with a clear view of both the approaching road and my security camera feeds on a tablet. Havoc and Mayhem had been moved to their strategic location near the side entrance, the same entrance the HOA had used during their previous trespassing. Their temporary enclosure was secure, but featured a gate latch that I knew Havoc could manipulate given sufficient motivation. Nearby, I had scattered their favorite treats, apple slices and carrots, just beyond the fence line. Lightning split the sky as 3 SUVs pulled up outside my property at precisely 9:30 a.m. Through sheets of rain, I recognized Margaret leading a small procession including 2 animal control officers and several board members, all hunched under inadequate umbrellas. They had not expected biblical-level downpour. My security cameras captured everything as they bypassed my front gate, which still bore the broken chain from their previous violation. Just as I had anticipated, they approached through the side entrance, trespassing through the same access point as before, a critical legal error that my cameras were documenting in high definition. I stood on my porch, smartphone recording in hand, protected from the downpour by the overhanging roof. The group struggled through the mud, designer shoes, and pressed pants quickly becoming casualties of the terrain. Margaret wore a transparent rain poncho over her cashmere sweater, her face twisted in disgust at the conditions. "You are currently trespassing on private property during severe weather conditions," I called out over the thunderclaps when they were close enough to hear me. "This property is under video surveillance, and you have not been granted permission to enter." Their expressions shifted from smugness to uncertainty as I referenced specific county ordinances prohibiting their actions. The animal control officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "We have provided proper notification of inspection," Margaret shouted over the rain, producing a laminated document from her folder. "And we have authorization to remove non-compliant livestock." "That document does not constitute legal authorization to enter private property," I countered, continuing to record. "And County Statute 42.3 specifically prohibits removal of farm animals without proper court orders, which you do not possess." Margaret's face contorted with frustration as she realized their tactical error. She turned to the animal control officers, gesturing emphatically toward the property. "The animals are clearly in violation of community guidelines. You have the authority to remove them." The senior animal control officer shook his head. "Ma'am, we need to verify proper documentation before proceeding. If the property owner is correct about County Statute 42.3. Then chaos erupted. A particularly violent thunderclap directly overhead caused everyone to jump. The junior animal control officer, already nervous about the situation, dropped the gate latch he had been examining. At that precise moment, Havoc, who had been watching the proceedings with unusual intensity, saw his opportunity. With practiced precision, he pushed against the gate while Mayhem provided additional force from behind. The gate swung open with surprising force, catching the officer on his shoulder. Havoc and Mayhem, sensing their moment, burst through the opening with supernatural speed, darting between legs and vehicles with the agility of animals suddenly granted freedom. Margaret screamed as Mayhem's horns grazed her designer rain boots. The inspection party scattered in panic, slipping in mud and colliding with each other as they attempted to avoid the charging goats. Within seconds, complete disorder reigned. Board members retreated toward their vehicles, while the animal control officers made half-hearted attempts to corral the goats, hindered by the downpour and unfamiliar terrain. "My garden!" Margaret shrieked as Havoc and Mayhem bounded past her, heading directly toward the subdivision entrance. "Stop them!" Through the torrential downpour, I watched my goats disappear into the manicured subdivision. headed directly toward what I knew was Margaret's award-winning front garden with its imported Japanese maple saplings. The inspection party scattered completely, leaving gates wide open in their retreat. The animal control van spun its wheels in the mud as the driver attempted to pursue the goats down the main subdivision road. I maintained my composed position on the porch, smartphone still recording, as the chaos unfolded. "You might want to close the gates behind you," I called out helpfully to the retreating figures, "unless you want more animals to escape due to your negligence." But it was too late. The HOA contingent had fled in disarray, leaving gates open and mud tracks across my property. Through the storm, I could hear distant shouts and car alarms from the direction of Willow Creek Estates. The storm had provided perfect cover for what would become neighborhood legend, the Great Goat Invasion of Willow Creek Estates. As thunder continued to rumble overhead, I could not help but smile at the poetic justice unfolding. I had not released the goats intentionally, but I could not have planned a more perfect scenario if I had tried. I stepped back into my house and called Lisa to update her on the situation. "Operation Goat Liberation has experienced an unexpected acceleration," I told her, watching the continuing chaos on my security camera feeds. "Havoc and mayhem are currently redecorating the subdivision." The morning after the storm broke with brilliant sunshine that illuminated a transformed neighborhood. After confirming that my security cameras had captured everything, I ventured into Willow Creek Estates to assess the situation and hopefully retrieve my goats. What I found exceeded my wildest expectations. Social media had exploded overnight with photos and videos of my 2 goats lounging atop luxury SUVs, decimating carefully cultivated rose bushes, and most notably, completely devouring Margaret's $15,000 landscaping that had won Garden of the Year 3 consecutive times. The property damage was selective, almost surgically precise. Every board member who had voted against me discovered their botanical treasures reduced to stems and mulch. Gerald's prized tulip collection had been trampled beyond recognition. Bate, who had once suggested compromise but ultimately sided with Margaret, found her decorative koi pond turned into a goat watering hole, the expensive fish mysteriously unharmed but thoroughly traumatized. Most impressive was the devastation visited upon Margaret's front garden. Her imported Japanese maple saplings had been reduced to twigs. The sculpted hedges that spelled out WCE for Willow Creek Estates now resembled abstract art. The garden gnome collection that Margaret had frequently featured in the community newsletter lay scattered across her lawn like casualties of a tiny war. Neighborhoods operate on gossip currency, and suddenly mine was flowing freely as information spread about the HOA's illegal entry, their destruction of my property, and their negligent release of my animals. Residents who had previously avoided eye contact now approached me with thinly veiled amusement, sharing stories of Margaret's hysterical reaction when she found Mayhem standing on her custom garden bench, chewing contemplatively on her prized roses. By afternoon, an emergency community meeting had been called. The clubhouse was packed with residents I had never seen before. People stood along walls and sat in aisles, buzzing with excitement at the unprecedented drama. My attorney Richard had agreed to attend, bringing a portable projector with him. As the meeting began, he calmly set up at the side of the room, connecting his laptop to the device. Margaret attempted to call the meeting to order, her voice strained and her appearance uncharacteristically disheveled. "We are here to discuss the animal control incident and resulting property damage," she began, avoiding specific mention of goats or my name. "Before we proceed," Richard interrupted politely, "my client would like to share some relevant information." Without waiting for permission, he projected my security footage on the wall, clearly showing trespassing and property destruction by HOA representatives. The video was damning, board members ignoring posted no trespassing signs, animal control officers expressing reservation about their legal authority, and most importantly, the clear documentation of who had actually left the gate open, allowing the goats to escape. This appears to be a clear violation of County Statute 42.3, Richard noted calmly as Margaret's face turned ashen. Unauthorized entry onto private property, attempted seizure of livestock without proper documentation, and negligence resulting in property damage, both to my client's gate and subsequently to community properties. What followed was unexpected. Neighbor after neighbor stood to share their own stories of HOA overreach and intimidation. A retired couple described being fined for having grandchildren visit too frequently. A single mother detailed receiving violations for hanging laundry in her backyard. An elderly man recounted being threatened with liens for planting vegetables instead of decorative flowers. The tide had turned dramatically. By evening, the board had called a recess to consult privately about the situation. When they returned 2 hours later, Gerald, not Margaret, addressed the room. The board has reviewed the situation and acknowledges certain procedural errors may have occurred, he stated carefully. We propose the following resolution in the interest of community harmony. By midnight, a new agreement sat before us. My property would receive agricultural exemption status, my animals could remain, and the HOA would cover all damages in exchange for me dropping potential legal actions. Margaret was conspicuously absent from the signing ceremony, having resigned for personal reasons, effective immediately. As I drove home under starlight, both troublemaking goats sleeping peacefully in my trailer after their adventure, I reflected on the irony. The very animals that Margaret had found so offensive had become the instruments of justice. The HOA that had sought to enforce conformity had been undone by its own rigidity. The following week, 6 of my goats returned from Lisa's farm to rejoin the herd. Havoc and Mayhem received extra treats for their service, though I would never admit that publicly. The community entered a new phase as Gerald, now interim HOA president, implemented more reasonable policies and actually sought input from all residents, not just those with the most expensive properties. Sometimes justice requires unexpected champions. In my case, 2 ornery goats with impeccable taste in garden destruction and perfect timing for neighborhood revolution. As Old Man Jenkins nuzzled my hand during evening feeding, I whispered a truth I had learned through this ordeal. Sometimes the most powerful response to unreasonable authority is not defiance or surrender, but simply letting nature take its course.